covenant, the law, and the worship was what preserved the relationship and communication of the people of God and determined the Hebrews' entire religious, social, and political life. Simultaneously, through these, the presence of the Word is revealed in the Old Testament before his incarnation. He it was that made the covenant and gave the law, and he was the God whom Israel worshiped. This is what we've been talking about for weeks and weeks and weeks, and which is really a key. You might think, well, isn't that kind of obvious? No, actually, unfortunately, even among Roman Catholics and Protestants, it's not obvious. They have other ideas. There's other theories. They don't talk about the logos being Christ himself, being the one who became incarnate, being the one who spoke to Abraham. And so we can go back like we did a couple of weeks ago when we were looking at the Pope's announcements. I'm going to be connecting this tonight to some contemporary events. I think it's important, right? We're reading this, we're learning this to apply it. That's why we're here tonight. To apply it to our life and to make it help us to understand the world and what's going on, not fall into delusion. So if we apply this a bit to what we read a couple weeks ago, if you're interested, you can go and find it just a few live streams ago, when we analyzed the Pope's words and Vatican II's words. If you go to Vatican II, in there, they say that Abraham worshiped the one God. Abraham worshiped the same and the Holy Trinity. And that's true. But they said the Muslims also worship the one God, the Holy Trinity, right? But so do they though? They reject the Holy Trinity? They reject Christ's incarnation and he's God. They reject. So they're not like Abraham. But they likened the Muslims to Abraham. But Abraham worshipped and was communicating with and in communion with the pre-incarnate Logos, right? So the Word that was revealed in the Old Testament before his incarnation. So anyone who imagines that it's not Christ, that it's not the Holy Trinity that's speaking to the people of old, then they can fall into terrible errors and delusions, and they can speak of those who reject Christ as being ones who worshipped and were like Abraham in that. No, that's not possible. It's not true, and it's a major delusion, unfortunately, that crept into the documents of Vatican II. Now, Abraham was the first to receive the title of prophet in Genesis 27. Faith seems to have been the essence of Abraham's religion. He believed absolutely and obeyed God without objection. These elements acquire even greater significance given that there was then as of yet no law. So Abraham himself was the unwritten law and precept, as we read in this text that's being cited here. It's a Greek text. So this is extremely important, right? Because he's the prototype of the faithful, of all the faithful, and in him, all the faithful who will come to Christ, will be children of Abraham through faith. And he's a great example for everyone. And so this absolute and unquestioning obedience to God, to Christ, is the cornerstone, and it's clear in the New Testament. It's the cornerstone of everything. It's the cornerstone of and the reason for the miracles and for the healings and for the preaching and all of it, right? It's always the cornerstone, the trust in God, in blessing. We all struggle with that, don't we? We hear questions again and again every live stream, but we all have the same questions, and that is, how do I increase the faith? How do I go deeper? How do I go? So it's good. We're over the target, right? Keep going and don't ever give up, because this is the essence of and the foundation of the life in Christ. So for these reasons, God, quote, as it says in Genesis 15:18, made a covenant with Abram, saying, unto thy seed have I given this land, although he had still no child. So he spoke prophetically, as the saints do by God's inspiration, and they saw the future, and he said, this is what will happen. I will give to thy seed. What is even more significant, after the sacrifice of his son Isaac, God made another covenant with him and promised him that from his generation the Messiah would come. In thy seed shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because thou hast obeyed my voice. So that blessing of all the nations, not just the people that will be children of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, but all the nations, of course, is the Messiah, right? He's the one who has blessed all the nations and comes to save all the nations. So in Abraham already, there's the second covenant, not just the land, right? That was just a necessary temporal question of establishing his descendants. Far greater than that is that the seed of Abraham, in this seed, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. And it's impossible to understand that blessing if Israel remains this exclusivist, the old Israel, now in the eyes of Jews today, that the Messiah is only for them, and all the rest of that is mistakenly claimed by contemporary Judaism. They don't understand who the Messiah is. I don't know how they would unpack that blessing. It'd be a very indirect blessing, wouldn't it? The covenant that was confirmed before of God in Christ, the law, which was 430 years after, cannot disannul that it should make the promise of none effect. For if the inheritance, the salvation, be of the law, it is no more of promise. In other words, it's not a promised gift, but a reward for the keeping of the law. But God gave it as a gift to Abraham by promise. This is Galatians 3:17-18. As a confirmation of this covenant, God gave the commandment of circumcision. So to confirm that indeed they are enjoying the fruits of this covenant, the identity of those who keep the covenant, they had this external sign, which of course, as Paul says in fighting the Judaizers in the early church, this is no longer necessary because we have the fulfillment of this covenant, right? It is a gift given to Abraham by promise. In other words, will come in the future. So even before the Sinai covenant and before the giving of the law, the promise was given to Abraham, which constitutes a milestone and a landmark in the history of the Israelite people. This promise, this covenant, was fulfilled with the birth of Christ. So everything points to Christ. The Jews boasted that they were children of Abraham. Nonetheless, the true children of Abraham are not the fleshly children, but the children of the promise. They are those who have a spiritual, not a fleshly kinship with him, who keep his covenant and who believe in Christ, regardless of whether they be Jews or Gentiles. This is the great divide, right? Between those who truly worship the Messiah and follow him and those who do not. What is that divide? The spiritual and not fleshly kinship. So it doesn't matter that they are Jews and they have fleshly kinship and they're keeping the covenant, the old covenant, or they're circumcising. These things cannot trump and put aside, be more important, God forbid, than the spiritual covenant that is promised and given through Abraham in Christ. In faith, in obedience, and in virtue, Abraham surpasses Isaac and Jacob, to whom the promises were repeated, but the apparent angel of the Lord, who is in fact the pre-incarnate Word, revealing himself by the apparent angel of the Lord. So the angel of the Lord is the Logos, the pre-incarnate Logos, who then becomes incarnate and is the Messiah. He's the one that is speaking to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and he's revealing himself. The patriarch Abraham is the most significant person in the sacred history of the Old Testament. For to him was given the promise that the Messiah would be his descendant. And furthermore, God promised him that he would become the progenitor of a great people, not of Israel, but of a people of grace, that is, of the church. In Genesis 18:18, we read, Abraham shall become a great and populous nation, and in him shall all the nations of the earth be blessed. And it's pretty obvious if you look back 2,000 years now, all of the world has been blessed by what? By Judaism or by Christ? By Christianity. That is spread throughout the world and brought so many spiritual and moral and all types of blessings to all of humanity. Now let's hear from St. John. The prophets pre-announced the contracting of a new covenant. He who contracts the new covenant is God himself, who drew up the old covenant. All right, so old covenant, new covenant, it's all God. Listen to what St. John says. It was the only begotten Son of God. He gave the law and worked all of the miracles for them. This is apparent from the Old Testament itself. Jeremiah the prophet says, I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers. In order to show that he was the lawgiver of both covenants, St. John Chrysostom, the lawgiver and he who provided both covenants are one, and that is Christ. So anyone, again, I'm going to repeat myself a bit, but anyone, including the Pope of Rome or anybody else in any hierarchical position, archbishops, doesn't matter. Anybody who stands and says the religions are passed to God, there are other ways to God. We don't need the covenant established by Christ. We don't need the recognition of his incarnation, all these things. I mean, it's just unbelievable that anybody who calls himself a Christian would believe this, but this is where we're at. This is the subtle but slimy ascent of the Masonic ideas among so-called Christians, right? The idea that there are many paths up the mountain. It's famously said among others, Fritjof Schuon, but even some contemporary archbishops have this idea that there are many paths up the mountain, and we don't know, we can't see because they're all, they're on this other side of the mountain, and if we assume that they're not also paths up the mountain, we're bigots, we're racists. It's mind-boggling. But right here, St. John, St. Gregory, and all the choir of saints say, no, we have a covenant. The covenant was made by the same who made the old covenant. There is no other God in the Old Testament that somebody's worshiping. They call themselves Muslims. There's no other God that maybe the Jews are also worshiping. No, they're not. They ceased to worship the one God in Trinity when they rejected the incarnate Logos, who became incarnate and dwelt among them and talked to them, and they rejected him as the incarnate Logos. So they ceased from that point on to have any relationship with the Holy Trinity. Isn't that obvious? Is that a child, I think, can figure this out? But in fact, we have leaders of religions and religious people saying, no, it's all one God. It's right there, and not possible to believe that the God of Abraham was anybody but the Trinity and the incarnate and pre-incarnate Logos. It's unbelievable.